I was 32 years old when a single sentence changed the way I understood my entire life. You should probably tell him the truth someday, the voice said quietly from the other room. At first I thought I had misheard it, but the silence that followed felt heavy, like something important had just slipped into the open air and didn't know how to hide again. I wasn't trying to listen. I had just stopped by my parents' house on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind of slow Midwestern day where the sunlight settles across the kitchen table and the only sound is the refrigerator humming. My name is Daniel Carter, and until that day, I believed I knew exactly who I was. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind with trimmed lawns, 4th of July block parties, and neighbors who had known each other for 20 years. My father, Thomas Carter, worked as an accountant. My mother, Margaret Carter, taught second grade at the elementary school 3 miles from our house. They were good people, reliable people, the kind of parents who packed school lunches, showed up at every parent-teacher conference, and reminded you to drive carefully when you borrowed the car. From the outside, my childhood looked normal, safe, predictable, and yet, if I'm honest, there had always been a faint feeling I couldn't explain. Not pain, not even sadness, just the quiet sense that something didn't quite line up. Growing up, I noticed small things. My sister, Rachel, had my father's green eyes and my mother's sharp cheekbones. When people saw the three of them together, they would smile and say things like, "You can tell she's your daughter." When they looked at me, they hesitated for half a second longer than usual. I told myself it meant nothing. Families come in all kinds of combinations, after all. By the time I reached adulthood, I had built a life that felt solid. I worked as a civil engineer for a firm in downtown Columbus. I had an apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house and a wife named Emily who loved Sunday morning farmers markets and old bookstores. Life moved in comfortable patterns. Work during the week, dinner with friends, visits to my parents every couple of weekends. Nothing dramatic, nothing mysterious, which is why that quiet sentence drifting through the hallway that afternoon felt so strange. I had been walking toward the kitchen when I heard my mother speaking softly. Her voice carried the careful tone people use when they're discussing something delicate. "You should probably tell him the truth someday." My father replied so quietly that I almost missed it. "It's been 32 years, Margaret. Maybe it's better this way." 32 years. The number settled in my mind before I fully understood why. I stood there for a moment, halfway between the hallway and the kitchen, staring at a framed photograph on the wall. It was a picture from my college graduation. My parents stood on either side of me, smiling proudly beneath the bright May sunlight. I had seen that photo hundreds of times, but in that moment, something about it felt different. I couldn't explain it yet, but a small voice inside me whispered that the conversation I had just overheard wasn't random. It was about me. I stepped into the kitchen then, forcing my footsteps to sound casual. My parents immediately stopped talking. My mother turned toward me with the same warm smile she had worn for my entire life. "Daniel," she said, "I didn't hear you come in." I smiled back, just as easily as I always had. But inside, a strange thought had already begun forming, quiet and persistent. If the truth had been hidden for 32 years, what exactly had I been living inside all this time? I did not say anything about what I had heard that afternoon. I stayed for dinner, just like I always did, sitting at the same oak table where I had eaten thousands of meals growing up. My mother served roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, the same kind of meal she had made for as long as I could remember. My father talked about a client at work who kept sending paperwork late. My mother mentioned one of her students who had just learned how to read his first chapter book. Everything sounded normal, almost too normal. I kept waiting for one of them to say something that would connect to the quiet conversation I had overheard in the hallway, but nothing came. They smiled, asked about Emily, asked about my job, and reminded me to take leftovers home. If someone had walked into that kitchen at that moment, they would have seen an ordinary family sharing. An ordinary dinner. But inside my head, something had shifted. I found myself watching my parents in a way I never had before. I noticed the way my mother carefully avoided certain topics. I noticed the way my father seemed to pause before answering simple questions. Maybe those things had always been there. Maybe I had just never paid attention before. When dinner ended, I helped my mother carry plates to the sink. She thanked me with the same warm smile she had given me my entire life. "Drive safely, Daniel," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Call us when you get home." I nodded and said I would. But as I walked out to my car and started the engine, the quiet question that had begun forming earlier that afternoon grew louder. 32 years. My father had said it clearly. It had been 32 years. That number stayed with me the entire drive back to my apartment. The evening sky was fading into that soft purple color that appears right after sunset in Ohio, and traffic moved slowly along Interstate 270. Normally, I would turn on the radio or call Emily during the drive. That night, I drove in silence. Memories began rising one by one, small moments from my childhood that had never meant much before. The first time someone asked if I was adopted. I must have been about 10 years old. A kid on my little league team had looked at me and then at my parents sitting in the bleachers. "You do not look like them," he said casually, the way children say things without thinking. I had laughed it off at the time. My mother had laughed too. She told me families came in all shapes and colors and personalities. I believed her. Another memory surfaced. A visit to the doctor when I was 16. The nurse had asked about family medical history. My mother hesitated for a moment before answering. I had assumed she simply did not remember the details. Now that hesitation looked different in my mind. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of our apartment building, my thoughts were moving faster than I could organize them. Emily was sitting on the couch when I walked in, reading one of her paperback mystery novels. She looked up and smiled. "How were your parents?" she asked. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and took a slow breath before answering. "They were good," I said. And that was true. They had always been good to me. Kind, supportive, steady. But as I stood there in the quiet living room, a realization settled over me with surprising clarity. If the conversation I had overheard was really about me, then my life might have been built on a story I did not fully understand. And for the first time in 32 years, I felt the need to find out what that story really was. I did not sleep much that night. I lay awake beside Emily, staring at the ceiling while the quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Every time I closed my eyes, the same sentence replayed in my mind. "You should probably tell him the truth someday." It had sounded calm when my mother said it, almost casual. But the more I thought about it, the heavier those words became. Truth about what? About me. Around 2 in the morning, I finally got out of bed and walked to the kitchen. Our apartment was small but comfortable, about 800 square feet, with a narrow hallway leading to a modest living room and a tiny kitchen that Emily loved to decorate with plants. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window looking down at the empty parking lot. That was when another memory surfaced, one I had not thought about in years. I was about 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. My mother was helping Rachel with a school project in the next room. I remember asking my father a question about our family history because we were working on a genealogy assignment at school. Most kids were filling out family trees that went back 3 or 4 generations. I had asked my father where our family originally came from before Ohio. He paused for a moment longer than usual before answering. Then he said something simple. "Pennsylvania. Our family had roots in Pennsylvania." I accepted that answer without question at the time. But the truth was, I never saw any old photos from Pennsylvania. No stories about grandparents or great-grandparents who lived there. Just that single explanation that ended the conversation quickly. Standing in the kitchen that night, I realized how many small moments like that had existed throughout my life. Each one seemed harmless on its own, but now they felt like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across 32 years. The next morning, Emily found me sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She walked over in her soft gray sweater, still half asleep, and sat down across from me. "You are up early," she said gently. I nodded, but did not answer right away. For a long moment, I just stared at the wood grain of the table, trying to organize the thoughts moving through my head. Finally, I said the first honest thing that came to mind. "Emily, have you ever felt like there was something about your life that did not quite add up?" She studied my face carefully. Emily had always been good at noticing when something was wrong even before I said it out loud. "Daniel," she said slowly, "what happened yesterday?" I told her everything. The conversation in the hallway. The way my parents stopped talking when I entered the room. The number that would not leave my mind. 32 years. Emily listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together. "Do you think they were talking about you?" she asked softly. I let out a slow breath. "I do not know," I said. "But if they were, then something about my life might not be what I always believed." The room grew quiet after that. Outside, The morning sun was beginning to rise over the row of apartment buildings across the street, casting long golden lines across the floor. Emily finally reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "If there is something they never told you," she said calmly, "then you deserve to know." Her words settled into my thoughts with surprising clarity. For most of my life, I had trusted that everything about my past was exactly as it seemed. But now a quiet certainty was forming inside me. If there really was a truth hidden somewhere in those 32 years, I was no longer sure I could ignore it. I drove back to my parents' house 3 days later on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The decision had been forming slowly since that morning conversation with Emily, but once the thought settled in my mind, it refused to leave. I told myself I was only going there to pick up an old toolbox my father had promised me months ago. That was the excuse I repeated in my head as I turned off the highway and drove through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood. The houses looked exactly the same as they always had. The same maple trees lined the sidewalks. The same basketball hoop stood in front of the Miller family's garage. Even the Carter house looked unchanged, with the white shutters my mother insisted on repainting every spring and the small American flag near the porch. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine running. The house in front of me had been my home for 18 years. Every memory from my childhood lived somewhere inside those walls. Yet that afternoon it felt slightly unfamiliar, like I was about to walk into a place that held answers I was not completely prepared to hear. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. My mother answered the door within seconds, as if she had been expecting someone. Her expression brightened the moment she saw me. "Daniel," she said with genuine surprise. "I thought you were at work today." I smiled and stepped inside. The house smelled exactly the way it always had, a mixture of lemon cleaner and the cinnamon candles my mother loved during the colder months. "I had the afternoon free," I explained casually. "I remember Dad said I could grab that old toolbox from the basement." She nodded immediately. "Of course. Your father is still at the office, but you know where everything is." That was true. I knew that house better than any place in the world. I walked down the narrow hallway toward the basement door, my footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor. The basement stairs creaked slightly as I descended, just as they had when I was a teenager sneaking down to watch late-night television. At the bottom of the stairs, the familiar basement opened into view. Shelves filled with old storage boxes lined the walls. My father's workbench stood beneath a small window that let in a thin beam of daylight. I walked slowly across the room, pretending to search for the toolbox, but my attention kept drifting toward the shelves along the far wall. That was where my parents stored documents and photo albums. Old tax records, school papers, folders filled with the small pieces of life people collect over decades. I told myself I should not look through them. I had not come here to investigate anything. But the thought of that conversation in the hallway returned once again, persistent and impossible to ignore. 32 years. I reached toward one of the storage boxes and lifted the lid carefully. Inside were folders arranged neatly in rows. My mother had always been extremely organized. Each folder had a small handwritten label on the front. Insurance documents, mortgage papers, medical records. My eyes moved slowly across the labels until one folder caught my attention. The label simply read birth records. My hand froze in place for a moment before I realized what I was doing. I pulled the folder from the box and carried it to the workbench beneath the window. Dust floated quietly in the narrow beam of sunlight as I opened the folder. Several documents rested inside, each placed neatly inside clear plastic sleeves. I slid the first one out and unfolded it slowly. At first glance it looked like a standard birth certificate. The official seal, the state name printed across the top. My eyes moved down the page until they reached the line that listed the parents' names. And that was when the quiet feeling that had been growing inside me for days suddenly became something real. Because the names written on that document were not Thomas Carter and Margaret Carter. They were names I had never seen before in my life. I read the names again slowly, making sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. The first name listed under mother was Laura Bennett. The name listed under father was Daniel Bennett. Neither name meant anything to me. I stood there in the quiet basement staring at the document while the afternoon sunlight moved slightly across the workbench. For a long moment, I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe this was someone else's document placed in the wrong folder. Maybe it belonged to a relative. But the longer I looked at the page, the more details I recognized. The date of birth was mine. The hospital listed at the top was the same hospital my parents had always said I was born in. Even the time of birth matched the story my mother had told me many times growing up. For 12 in the morning on a rainy Thursday. The details were identical. Everything about the document pointed directly to me, except the names of the parents. I felt a strange stillness settle over the room as the realization slowly took shape in my mind. I was not looking at someone else's record. I was looking at my own birth certificate. And according to that paper, the people who raised me were not the people who brought me into the world. I carefully placed the document back on the workbench and opened the folder again, hoping to find something that would explain what I was seeing. Inside the folder were several more documents, all organized with the same neat precision my mother used for everything. One of the envelopes had a printed heading that read Adoption Records. My hands paused above it for a moment. The quiet feeling I had been carrying for days was no longer just a suspicion. It was becoming something much clearer. I opened the envelope slowly and slid out the papers inside. The first page confirmed everything in calm, official language. It stated that a child named Daniel Bennett had been legally adopted by Thomas Carter and Margaret Carter when he was just a few weeks old. That child was me. I read the page twice before I fully understood what it meant. The life I remembered so clearly had not begun the way I believed it had. The people I called Mom and Dad had chosen me. They had not given birth to me. The room felt very quiet as I sat down on the wooden stool beside my father's workbench. I tried to imagine the moment 32 years earlier when my parents signed those documents. A young couple walking into a courthouse or an adoption office somewhere in Ohio. My mother probably nervous. My father probably calm and practical the way he always was. Somewhere in that moment, they decided that a newborn child they had never met would become their son. I did not know whether to feel shocked or strangely calm. Instead, I felt something else entirely. Understanding. Suddenly, dozens of memories from my childhood arranged themselves differently in my mind. The pauses during family history conversations. The vague answers about relatives I had never met. Even the quiet protectiveness my mother sometimes showed whenever someone asked too many questions about the past. None of it had been random. It had been careful, thoughtful, protective. I looked again at the adoption papers resting on the workbench. There was one more page attached to the file. It listed the name of the agency that handled the adoption and the county where the paperwork had been finalized. Franklin County, the same county where I had grown up. That meant the answers I was looking for might not be very far away. I closed the folder slowly and placed it back into the storage box exactly where I had found it. The basement was silent again except for the faint ticking of an old wall clock near the stairs. For 32 years, I believed I understood the story of my life. But as I stood there in that quiet basement, one truth had become impossible to ignore. My life had not begun with the Carter family. And somewhere out there were two people whose names I had just seen for the very first time. For a long moment, I stood in the basement without moving, listening to the quiet ticking of the old wall clock near the stairs. The sound seemed louder than usual, each second marking the slow shift of something inside my mind. 32 years. That was how long the truth had been sitting quietly in a folder on that shelf. I placed the box lid back carefully and walked toward the basement stairs, trying to steady my thoughts before going upstairs. When I opened the kitchen door, my mother was standing at the counter slicing apples into neat pieces the way she always did when she planned to bake a pie later in the afternoon. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. "Did you find the toolbox?" she asked with a gentle smile. I nodded automatically, even though the toolbox was the last thing on my mind. For a moment, I considered pretending nothing had happened, the same way I had pretended after overhearing their conversation days earlier. But now the truth was no longer just a possibility floating in the air. I had seen it printed clearly on official documents. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down slowly. My mother noticed the change in my expression almost immediately. She set the knife down and turned toward me with quiet concern. "Daniel, is everything all right?" she asked. I took a breath before answering. "Mom," I said carefully. I was in the basement looking through the storage boxes. Her face remained calm, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, the way it does when someone realizes a conversation is about to turn serious. I continued slowly, choosing each word with care. I found a folder labeled birth records. The kitchen became very still. My mother did not move for several seconds. Then she pulled out the chair across from me and sat down quietly. I had never seen her look uncertain before. She had always been the person who knew exactly what to say in every situation. But now she simply folded her hands together on the table and waited. I spoke again before I could lose the courage to continue. The birth certificate inside does not list you and Dad as the parents. The words hung in the air between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then my mother exhaled slowly and looked down at her hands. When she finally raised her eyes again, the expression on her face was not anger or fear. It was something closer to relief. "We always knew this day might come," she said softly. Hearing those words felt strangely calm rather than shocking. It was as if some quiet part of me had been expecting them all along. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked. My voice sounded steady even though my mind was still racing through dozens of questions. My mother leaned back slightly in her chair and looked toward the window above the sink, where the late afternoon sunlight was beginning to fade. "When you were very young, we planned to tell you," she explained gently. "But every year it became harder. You were happy. Your life felt normal. We did not want to risk changing that." She paused for a moment before continuing. "And we were afraid that you might think we loved you any less if you knew the truth." I shook my head slowly. "I never would have thought that." She smiled faintly at that, though there was a sadness behind it. "Parents worry about many things that never happen," she said. I studied her face for a moment, realizing that the woman sitting across from me was still the same person who had read bedtime stories when I was a child and helped me with homework late at night. The documents I had found changed the story of how my life began, but they did not erase the years that followed. Still, one question remained impossible to ignore. "Do you know anything about them?" I asked quietly. My mother understood immediately who I meant. She nodded once, slowly. "A little," she said. "Not much, but enough to know that the decision to place you for adoption was made because they believed you would have a better life." She paused again before adding gently, "And we spent the last 32 years trying to make sure that was true." I sat there listening to her words while the evening light faded across the kitchen floor. The truth I had discovered in the basement was real, but it was not as simple as I had imagined. It was not just about where I came from. It was also about the people who had chosen to raise me. My mother remained quiet for a moment after answering my question, as if she was carefully deciding how much of the past should finally be spoken aloud. The kitchen felt different now. The same room where I had eaten thousands of ordinary meals suddenly felt like a place where something important had shifted. I rested my hands on the table and waited. My mother had always believed in choosing words carefully, and I could see that habit guiding her now. "When we adopted you," she began slowly, "the agency explained only a few things about your biological parents. Some information was private, and some of it was simply unknown." Her voice was calm, but there was a softness in it that I had rarely heard before. "Your biological mother was very young," she continued. "She was not able to raise a child at that time in her life. The adoption counselor told us that she wanted you to grow up in a stable home." I listened quietly, absorbing each sentence. The idea that someone somewhere had once made such a difficult decision felt strange and distant, like a story that belonged to another life. My mother folded her hands again and looked directly at me. "She left a short letter," she said. "The agency kept it on file. We were allowed to read it, but we were told it should remain private unless you asked about your adoption someday." I felt my attention sharpen instantly. "A letter?" I asked. My mother nodded gently. "It was only a few paragraphs. She wrote that she hoped you would grow up surrounded by kindness and opportunity. She wanted you to have a future that she could not give you at that time." The words carried a quiet sincerity that settled deeply in my thoughts. For a moment, I imagined a young woman writing that message more than 3 decades earlier, not knowing where her child would grow up or what kind of person he might become. The thought was both distant and strangely personal at the same time. "Do you still have the letter?" I asked carefully. My mother hesitated for a moment before answering. "The agency kept the original, but they gave us a copy." She stood up slowly from the table and walked down the hallway toward the small study near the living room. I remained in my chair, listening to the quiet sound of drawers opening and closing in the next room. A few minutes later, she returned holding a small envelope. The paper looked slightly yellowed with age, as if it had been stored carefully for many years. She placed it on the table between us, but did not open it yet. "We never hid this because we were ashamed," she said gently. "We kept it because we believed it belonged to you." We just did not know when the right moment would come. I looked at the envelope for several seconds before touching it. My name was not written on the outside. There was only a simple label from the adoption agency, dated more than 30 years earlier. When I finally opened it, a single folded sheet of paper rested inside. The handwriting across the page was neat but slightly uneven, the way handwriting sometimes looks when someone is trying very hard to express something important. I read the letter slowly from beginning to end. The message was simple. It spoke about hope. It spoke about wanting a child to grow up safe and cared for. It spoke about trusting that somewhere a family would give him the life she could not provide. When I finished reading, I placed the paper gently back inside the envelope. For a long moment, neither my mother nor I spoke. Finally, I looked up at her again. "Did you ever try to find out more about them?" I asked quietly. My mother shook her head slowly. "The adoption was closed," she explained. "The agency believed it was best for everyone involved at the time." She paused before adding something else. "But times have changed since then. Records are easier to access now than they were 30 years ago." I understood immediately what she meant. Somewhere out, there were two names written on a birth certificate that I had never seen before. And for the first time in my life, the possibility of learning more about them no longer felt impossible. I drove home that evening with the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me. The letter inside felt strangely heavier than a single sheet of paper should have felt. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops by the time I pulled onto the highway, and the sky above Columbus had turned the deep blue color that appears just before night fully settles in. For most of the drive, I did not turn on the radio. My mind was too busy replaying everything that had happened during the past few hours. 32 years of quiet assumptions had shifted in the span of a single afternoon. Yet what surprised me most was not anger or confusion. Instead, I felt something closer to curiosity. Not about the past I had lived with the Carter family, because that part of my life was still solid and real. What had changed was the realization that there was another part of my story that had always existed just beyond my view. When I arrived at the apartment, Emily was sitting at the kitchen counter working on her laptop. She looked up the moment I walked in and immediately noticed the envelope in my hand. "You talked to your mother," she said softly. I nodded and placed the envelope on the counter between us. Emily closed her laptop slowly, giving me her full attention. I explained everything exactly as it had happened. The documents in the basement, the conversation at the kitchen table, the letter written by the young woman who had given birth to me. Emily listened quietly, the same thoughtful expression on her face that she always had when something important was unfolding. When I finished speaking, she rested her hands on the counter and asked the question that had already begun forming in my own mind. "Do you want to find them?" The apartment grew very quiet after she asked that. Through the window, I could see the glow of streetlights beginning to appear along the parking lot outside. I took a moment before answering, trying to understand my own thoughts clearly. "I do not know if I want to change anything," I said slowly. "The life I have is still the life that raised me." Emily nodded gently. "That makes sense." I continued carefully. "But I think I would like to understand where the rest of my story began." Saying those words out loud made something inside my mind settle into place. The idea was no longer just a possibility. It had become a decision. Emily stood up and walked to the bookshelf in the living room where she kept a collection of research guides and reference books from her graduate school days. She pulled out a thin notebook and returned to the counter. "If you decide to search," she said, opening the notebook, "there are ways to start." She wrote a few notes on the first page as she spoke. Adoption agencies, county records, public archives, even online genealogy databases that had become popular during the past decade. Each suggestion sounded practical and calm, the way Emily approached every challenge in her life. I realized something as I watched her writing down ideas. For years I had believed that the story of my life began with a hospital room in Columbus and two parents named Thomas and Margaret Carter. Now I understood that the story actually began a little earlier with two other names written quietly on a birth certificate: Laura Bennett and Daniel Bennett. Those names no longer felt distant or abstract. They were part of the same story that had eventually led to the life I was living now. Emily closed the notebook and slid it across the counter toward me. "You do not have to rush," she said gently. "But if you ever want to start looking, you already have two important pieces of information." I looked down at the page where she had written the names. For the first time in my life, the idea of learning more about the people behind those names felt possible, not urgent. Not overwhelming, just possible. And sometimes possibility is enough to begin a journey that has been waiting quietly for 32 years. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, long before the alarm on my phone was scheduled to ring. For several minutes I remained still, staring at the ceiling while the quiet sounds of the apartment slowly came to life around me. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The distant sound of a car starting somewhere in the parking lot outside. Normally mornings felt predictable, like the beginning of a routine I had followed for years. But that morning felt slightly different, as if the ground beneath the routine had shifted in a subtle way. I got out of bed and walked into the kitchen where Emily had already started brewing coffee. The warm smell filled the small room, familiar and comforting. She looked up and smiled gently when she saw me. Neither of us spoke right away. There was no need to repeat everything we had already discussed the night before. Instead, we shared the quiet moment while the coffee machine finished its slow rhythm of dripping water. I poured a cup and sat at the table, watching the early morning light move across the floor. The notebook Emily had started the previous evening was still resting on the counter. The page with the two names remained open. Laura Bennett, Daniel Bennett. Seeing those names again did not feel as unsettling as it had the day before. In fact, the feeling was surprisingly calm. For 32 years, I had lived a life shaped by the Carter family. Every birthday celebration, every school event, every conversation at the dinner table. Those moments were real and meaningful regardless of how my life began. Yet I also understood something new now. A person's story does not begin at the moment he becomes aware of it. It begins much earlier, sometimes with decisions made by people he may never have met. I finished my coffee slowly while thinking about the letter my biological mother had written decades earlier. The words were simple but sincere. She had hoped for kindness and opportunity in my future. In many ways, that hope had come true. My parents had given me a stable home. They had encouraged my education. They had supported me through every stage of growing up. The discovery of my adoption had not erased those years. If anything, it made them feel even more intentional. My parents had not simply raised a child who happened to be theirs. They had chosen to become my family. Later that afternoon, I drove back to their house again. This time the visit felt easier. When my mother opened the door, her expression held the same warmth it always had. My father had returned from work early and was sitting in the living room reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. For a moment, we simply stood there together in the quiet familiarity of the room. The truth we had discussed the day before did not hang heavily between us. Instead, it felt like a missing chapter that had finally been placed back into the story. I sat down beside my father, and we talked about ordinary things. Work, the upcoming baseball season, plans for a small family gathering later that month. My mother brought tea into the room and joined the conversation. Watching them together, I realized something important. Learning about my adoption had answered one question about where I came from. But it had also revealed something else about who I had become. Identity is not built from a single moment of origin. It is shaped by years of care, patience, and shared experiences. Before I left that evening, my mother walked with me to the front door. The porch light had just turned on automatically as the sun began to set. She placed her hand gently on my arm before I stepped outside. "Whatever you decide about searching for more answers," she said softly, "we will support you." I nodded and looked back at the house where I had grown up. The truth I discovered had changed the way I understood the beginning of my life. But it had not changed the people who stood beside me now. And in that quiet moment, I understood something clearly for the first time. A family is not only defined by the place where a story starts. Sometimes it is defined by the people who choose to stay with you for every chapter that follows.